Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we continue our reading of A Prophet in Babylon with Chapter 18, Part A, The Young Apostles. The summer months had come, those months in which cities are supposed to be empty, when churches are closed, and a truce is called to their activities. A brooding, stifling heat cloud rested over New York. The nights were terrible, nights when the lifeless air made sleep impossible. Far off in the summer woods, beside placid lakes or blue seas, the exiles from the cities gathered in happy crowds, congratulating themselves on their escape from the brazen furnace of the interminable streets, and forgetting the multitudes who remained at their posts, unable to buy themselves out of the cruel conscription of daily city drudgery. "New York is empty," said the papers. Never was there a sentence more ironically false. For Gaunt and his workers the summer brought no surcease of toil. Day by day the League of Service sent its messengers among the poor, for there was much sickness in the narrow streets and the airless tenements. Day by day also the mere growth of the movement made rest impossible for Gaunt. From every city of the Union came reports of its success. Every mail brought the names of new adherents and hundreds of requests for practical direction from the formation of local leagues. Gaunt struggled through July, grappling with a task beyond the strength of any dozen men, and the end of the month found him pale and worn. But if the flesh proved weak, there was no deficit of spirit. His prevailing mood was one which almost approached gaiety, the indomitable cheerfulness of one sustained by a force of vitalizing ideals. Palmer watched over him with more than a brother's care, and noted with anxiety his growing pallor. At last one day Palmer came to him with a new idea. "Do you remember the talks we used to have about the great religious reformers and their methods? Wesley, for example," said Palmer. "Certainly," said Gaunt. "It was through those talks we came to the discovery of our own path." "Well, there is still room for discovery," said Palmer. Gaunt laid down his pen. He was sitting at a desk loaded with the morning's mail, rapidly noting the contents of each letter and dictating brief replies. "That's right," said Palmer. "Let your correspondence go for the time, and let us talk." "Well, what have you to propose? Something new and daring, I'll be bound," said Gaunt with a smile. "No, it's not new, and it's hardly daring. But first tell me whether there is anything in that last week's mail which has particularly struck you." "Oh, it's all striking, for that matter," said Gaunt. "It's a wonderful thing to say, but out of 100 letters I seldom find one that is commonplace. They are almost all intimate expressions of sincere souls. Most of the writers are young." "Anything else?" "Yes, a considerable number are from young men of religious enthusiasm. Here, for example, is one that is typical. It's from a young minister. I'll read it to you. "Dear Sir, I do not know how any serious and good man can dissent from the ideas which control your work. I believe that all such men, either implicitly or explicitly, must agree with them. But the difficulty for me is the method of their practical application. Let me put my own case. I entered the ministry on an impulse of devout enthusiasm, as I suppose most men do. For those who enter the ministry with self-seeking motives are, I believe, very few. I hope I shall not be misunderstood when I say that the ideal of ministry appeals to the heroic fiber in me. It seemed to be the grandest of all earthly vocations to build up the living kingdom of God among men, and such a work appeared its own exciting great reward. Certainly at the time I entered the ministry, I was in that exalted mood of which any form of self-sacrifice or self-immolation for an ideal seems a positive attraction rather than a deterrent. My idealism was somewhat rudely handled by the theological seminary, as you will understand. But I consoled myself with the thoughts that I was only in the position of the painter who finds the hard technique of art a very different thing from the vague dream of art which impels his feet to the studio of the master. At all events, my idealism survived. I told myself that soon I would be in a church, and there the atmosphere would be very different. Like the painter, when once I had mastered the difficulties of technique, I should emerge into a free world where I could breathe and work with an unimpeded joy. At last the hour of my deliverance came. I was the minister of a church. It was a church which stood high in general repute, and my prospects were much brighter than those scores of men who started with me. I entered on my work resolved to build this living kingdom of God among men, to preach nothing but the truth as the truth was revealed to me, to give the whole strength of my mind and body to the task, to make religion a reality in my own life and the lives of those committed to my charge. By slow degrees it dawned upon me that my church was out of sympathy with the ideals which were the very breath of life to me. It was clear, to begin with, that my church did not want the truth in the sense in which I used the term. They were content with traditional truth, but with truth in any living form they were totally unacquainted. Certain doctrines or forms of words were to them symbols. They were used to the symbols, but the moment I used language which transgressed the symbol, they were offended and alarmed. Again, it was clear that they did not regard religion as having any particular bearing on the actualities of daily life. Religion was for them a series of propositions and assumptions dealing with matters which lay beyond the province of reason. It was a romance of the imagination and the emotions. It could not be conceived in the terms of plain conduct. Please do not think that I speak in any spirit of contempt. I will say at once, and with the utmost sincerity, that the people who composed my congregation were almost all good and kindly people. They were good to one another and to me. They were charitable to a variety of good causes and institutions. They lived on excellent terms with one another. But it soon became clear to me that they would have been just the same kind of persons without religion as with it. Religion had furnished them, no doubt, with a series of valuable restraints for conduct, but it had wrought no vital change in their characters. It was not an experience, it was only an external creed. Well, it might be said, surely there was enough good material here in any case out of which to build the kingdom of God. I can only reply that I found it otherwise, quite otherwise. For the very virtues in which these people excelled had bred in them an immense complacency. They were wholly satisfied with themselves, so much so that they could conceive of no need for improvement. And being for the most part people of middle age, occupying assured and comfortable positions in society, they were equally satisfied with the world as it was. I do not like to say it, yet it is true. They had been so long flattered upon their superiority that they expected flattery from the pulpit, and became irritated at the least criticism. My predecessor, a very amiable man, had flattered them for years, not intentionally or basedly, of course, but simply as an expression of his own amiability. You will understand what I mean. You will understand how the spirit of complacency thrives on such food, until without knowing it people become Pharisees, proud of being not as other men are, a select coterie out of real relation with life. Again and again I tried to awaken in them what I may call a consciousness of humanity. I sought honestly to show them the world as it was, and its needs. They simply did not choose to see it. You want us to do this or that for the poor, they said. Well, there are other churches to do that. It is not our work. Why give us repulsive details about poverty and vice? We come to church to be strengthened in our faith, not lacerated in our sympathies. It seemed to me a poor kind of faith, which needed so much strengthening. My idea of a church was an army always ready to be mobilized for active conquest. Their ideal was a select club existing for its own edification. Surely the most singular feature in a democratic country is an oligarchic church, but such is mine, and such are most of the churches of this city. And besides this, there is another thing to be noted. Kindly as my people are, yet they are absolutely selfish in the demands they make upon their minister. They require perpetual coddling. They want you to run to them at every call, and they resent your absorption in public work if it interferes with your power of attention to them. And so I have come to the melancholy conclusion that the church, that is my church, is only playing at Christianity after all. It does nothing. It makes no kind of impact on the world. If my church were blotted out by some catastrophe, if it were dissolved tomorrow, its loss would make no appreciable difference in the life of the city. The individual members would be, so far as I can judge, just as well off without religion as with it, for their religion is little more than a social bond. Is it worth my while to give the strength of my manhood simply to maintain something that is so miserably negative in its results? I am now 30. The next 20 years are everything. But if I could live twice 20 years in my present conditions, I believe nothing more would happen than has already happened. I entered the ministry with a brilliant dream of an onward march through many difficulties to ultimate conquest. My march has ended in a cul-de-sac. Perhaps I am in error through pride. I try to think of all the fine things which might have been said about doing the duty that lies nearest to your hand, and being content to make a few souls happier, but it seems to me that this is merely the doctrine of idleness and false humility. If Jesus had argued thus, he would have remained all his days in Nazareth. He certainly would never have entered into conflict with the Pharisees, and would never have been crucified. What am I to do? The only justification I can have for putting the question to you is that I regard you as my spiritual master. Give me anything to do that will mean active conflict, and I will try to do it. I have the better part of 2 months at my disposal this summer. They are yours, if you can use them. I want no holiday. The best of all vacations for me would be to plunge into the practical realities of life. I am yours truly, George Dean. An admirable letter, said Palmer, and as you say, quite typical. Its writer appears to be a strong and observant man who feels his position a bondage. To such a man, the worst of all tortures is futility, that sense that, work how he will, his work ends in nothing. It was my own torture, as you know, until I found the way out. I believe that there are hundreds of men in ministry today who feel just as this man feels. And that brings me to my point, said Palmer. What do you propose to do with men of this kind? Here is a great force going to waste. Don't you think you can utilize it? We certainly ought to. What's your plan? My plan is simple, and I believe practical. You and I believe in evangelism in the broad sense, don't we? And we have had our dream of various kinds of brotherhoods. Well, here is our opportunity. What we want is a revival of the medieval systems of preaching friars. The press is all very well, but it can never supersede the living voice. It can never equal it as an agent of conviction. It is the impact of personality that tells in most propaganda. Wesley knew his business when he sent out bands of workers who entered villages and cities in the spirit of conquest and lived their truth before the people as well as taught it. Now what I propose is this. Let us gather together 100 men of George Dean's type and use these precious weeks of summer by sending them out 2 and 2 into smaller towns to conduct missions, to rehabilitate the religious sense by their teaching and example. By outdoor preaching, you mean? Certainly. It's the most striking method of preaching, and it's the only way of reaching masses of people who under no circumstances will find their way into the halls and churches. I heard a famous preacher declare not long ago, said Gaunt with a laugh, that the weather in America will make outdoor preaching impossible. What nonsense, said Palmer. He should read Wesley's journal. Wesley found that even pouring rain was no obstacle to outdoor preaching. But our summer weather? Scene: a village green at close of an August day. Big leafy elms, a soft cool wind, everyone out of doors. What better opportunity do you want? Gaunt was silent for a few moments, and he said abruptly, We'll do it. We'll begin with Dean. And we'll stop there for this week. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 18, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.